The night my ex-husband walked into that gala with her on his arm, I was already there, standing in the middle of the room, champagne in hand, midnight blue gown, hair pinned back the way my new husband loves it. I heard Conrad's laugh before I saw his face, that low, practiced laugh, the one I spent 22 years learning to read. And then I saw her, red dress, his hand at her back, the woman he left me for. I didn't move, I didn't run, I didn't cry. Because here's what Conrad didn't know when he walked through those doors. He didn't know about the Tuesday night I sat on the bathroom floor for 4 hours. He didn't know about the apartment with the low ceilings where I talked myself into getting out of bed every single morning. He didn't know about the 8-month legal war to keep the company I built with my own hands while he slept. He didn't know about the man who fell in love with me, not the version of me that existed inside his life, but me. And then Conrad's eyes moved across the room, and they found me. And then he saw the ring on my finger. What happened in that ballroom? The conversation with his mother, the moment with her in the restroom, the 4 words I said to Conrad that changed everything. Stay with me. Because this story is not about him. It was never about him. This story is about what happens when a woman finally stops disappearing. Lesson line: if you've ever felt invisible inside a life you helped build, this story is proof that the end of one chapter is not the end of your story. It is sometimes the very beginning of the one that was always meant for you.
She heard him before she saw him, that laugh, low, practiced, like applause for himself. Vivian Hartwell stood near the east window of the Meridian Foundation ballroom and felt the sound move through her before her brain had time to process it. Her champagne glass was cold in her hand. The string quartet was playing something she couldn't quite name. The chandeliers above threw light in all directions, catching the crystal, the jewelry, the careful surfaces of 200 people performing their best versions of themselves. She had been here 40 minutes, long enough to feel at home, long enough to forget she was ever nervous. She turned slowly. The way you turn when your body already knows. Conrad Hartwell came through the main doors the way he always entered rooms, like the room had been waiting. Navy tuxedo, silver cufflinks that caught the light exactly right. His hair was the same. His posture was the same. He looked exactly the same, and she hated that, and then immediately decided she was done hating it. Sloane Mercer was on his arm. Vivian saw her in pieces. Red dress, dark hair falling past her shoulders. Young in a way that used to feel like a blade pressing against Vivian's sternum, and now felt like information. Just information. Sloane's smile was working hard. Her eyes moved across the room the way eyes do when they are checking. Checking who is here, checking who matters, checking whether they belong. Vivian set her champagne glass down on the table beside her. God, I was so stupid. The thought came fast and automatic, the way old thoughts do. No, stop. That's the old script. Put it down. She breathed. Once. Slowly. She had practiced this. Not the specific moment. She hadn't known Conrad would be here tonight, but she had practiced the feeling. The sudden ambush of memory. The way the body responds before the mind catches up. Daphne Whitmore appeared at her elbow. Daphne had the gift of arriving at exactly the right moment. She'd had it for 20 years. She materialized now with a fresh glass of champagne and a voice like dry kindling. Well, Daphne said quietly, he's aged. Vivian almost laughed. Not quite. But almost. She didn't move from where she was standing. She didn't step back toward the wall. She didn't look for the exit. She stood exactly where she was, in the midnight blue gown she'd chosen because she liked it. Not because of this, not for any reason connected to this. And she let herself feel the full weight of what was happening. Conrad hadn't seen her yet. He was near the entrance now, shaking hands with James Whitfield, the gala's host. The performance was familiar, the measured warmth, the eye contact that said you matter to me specifically. She had watched him do this at 100 events. She had stood beside him while he did it. She had replenished his drink and remembered the names of spouses and laughed at the right moments. She had been very good at that. His eyes moved across the room. Rooms like this, crowded, lit, full of familiar faces. Conrad's eyes always moved the same way, systematic, confident, like a man reading a document he'd already mastered. Then his eyes found her. She watched the half-second before recognition, his face in neutral, easy, unguarded. Then recognition arrived. Something shifted. She didn't have a word for what she saw in his face in that moment. It wasn't guilt. She'd seen his guilt before, and it looked different. It wasn't surprise exactly. It was something quieter, something that arrived slowly, like a sound you hear before you understand what made it. She isn't running. She watched him register that. She watched him understand that she was standing in the middle of this room, in midnight blue, with her champagne glass set down beside her, and her chin level, and she was not moving. Inside, her thoughts were moving fast. Not elegantly, not in complete sentences. 22 years. That's how long I knew that face. 22 years of learning to read him. The tightening around the eyes when he was calculating. The half-smile that never made it all the way up. I was fluent in Conrad Hartwell. I could read every word. I could parse every silence. That was the tragedy, actually. I read him perfectly. I just didn't believe what he was saying. She had checked her phone 3 times in the car on the way here. Lock, unlock, lock, unlock, lock. She'd caught herself doing it and laughed at herself, quietly, alone in the back of the car. You are 41 years old. You built a company. You signed the papers. You went to therapy. You moved on. You moved on so completely that you married someone else. Check the phone one more time, Vivian, just to be sure. She'd put it in her clutch. She'd walked through the front doors of the Meridian Foundation ballroom like someone who belonged there. And she had belonged. She did belong. That had been the whole point of the last 2 years. Conrad said something to James Whitfield that made both men smile. Then he turned slightly, his hand at the small of Sloane's back, and began to move into the room. Not toward Vivian, not away from her either, just into the room, the way people move when the geometry of the space is small and the evening is long, and some conversations are simply inevitable. They would speak tonight, both of them knew it. The string quartet finished their piece. A soft wave of applause moved through the room. Vivian picked up her champagne glass again and took a small, deliberate sip. The question, she thought, is not whether we'll speak. The question is who will be ready. She already knew the answer. She'd been ready for a long time. Daphne was watching her with the specific expression she reserved for moments that required attention, but not alarm. You good? Daphne asked. Surprisingly, Vivian said, and she meant it. She turned slightly so that the east window was behind her and the whole room was in front of her. The chandeliers, the white tablecloths, the 200 people performing themselves, Conrad and Sloane moving through the crowd. She saw the exact moment he noticed her left hand. The ring caught the chandelier light. Conrad's face did something she would think about for days afterward. Not pain, not regret, something more honest than either of those. Something that looked, from across a ballroom, remarkably like understanding, arriving 24 months too late. Conrad was on the far side of the room now. Sloane had found someone to talk to. A woman in green near the bar, someone Vivian didn't recognize. Sloane's hand moved expressively as she spoke. She laughed at something. Vivian watched and felt. Nothing she hadn't already processed. That was the thing about 2 years of actual work. The feelings didn't disappear. They just lost their teeth. Sloane tugged at Conrad's sleeve, small, possessive, and Vivian was 39 years old and standing in her kitchen in Greenwich, Connecticut, and it was a Tuesday evening in October, and the rigatoni sauce was bubbling on the stove. Memory doesn't ask permission, it just arrives. She had been using the jarred sauce. The brand from the back of the pantry she kept for nights when she was tired and didn't want to think. Preston was at college, his first semester. The house had a new sound to it, a particular quality of silence she was still learning to inhabit. She'd heard Conrad's car in the driveway at 6:47. She knew the sound of it, the way you know the sounds of your own home, the specific weight of the engine cutting off, the car door, the slight resistance of the front door that had needed weather stripping for 2 years, and neither of them had gotten around to fixing. He set his briefcase down. He didn't kiss her. He always kissed her, even at the end, when everything between them had become logistics and surface and performance. He kissed her when he came home. It was muscle memory. It was the last surviving habit of a marriage that had stopped being a marriage somewhere around year 15 without either of them formally acknowledging it. She kept stirring the sauce. She asked about his flight from Chicago. He said something short. She asked again. He said her name. Vivian. Not Viv, not sweetheart, not the shortened, affectionate version that meant she was his person in the room. Vivian. Full. Formal. The way you say someone's name when you need them to understand that what follows is serious. Like she was a client, she turned around. I knew. She would tell Dr. Fenwick later. Before a single word, I knew from the way he said my name. You can hear a marriage ending in the way a person says your name. The whole thing was right there, in 2 syllables. Viv-E-N, past tense. He didn't apologize first. He said he needed to be honest, like honesty was something he'd been conserving, saving up for the right moment, a gift he was finally ready to give her. He'd been seeing Sloan Mercer for 14 months. She was a senior associate at his firm. He cared about her. He wanted to be with her. He was sorry that this was happening this way. She had stood with the wooden spoon in her hand for the entire conversation. She didn't cry. Not then. She didn't yell either. She'd always thought, in the abstract way you think about disaster scenarios that won't happen to you, that she would yell. That she would be the kind of woman who threw something. That there would be some physical expression equal to the size of what was being said to her. Instead, she stood very still and held the wooden spoon and said, in a voice she didn't entirely recognize as her own, "Is she pregnant?" He said, "No." She said, "Then go." He looked at her for a moment. She looked back. Something moved between them that was too large and too quiet to name. Then he picked up his briefcase and left. She turned off the stove. She served herself a bowl of rigatoni. She sat at the kitchen table and ate it in the particular silence of a house where something enormous had just happened and the furniture didn't know yet. She washed the pot. She dried it. She put it away. She went upstairs. She sat on the bathroom floor for 4 hours. She didn't cry until the 3rd hour. When it came the way a storm comes when it's been building all day. Suddenly and completely, and with no consideration for your plans. Back in the ballroom, Vivian's hands were steady. She noticed this with something that felt like pride but was quieter than that, more private. Daphne appeared with a fresh champagne glass and the particular look that meant she'd been watching and had assessed the situation and had found it manageable. "Elliot just texted," Daphne said. 5 minutes out. Parking. "Good," Vivian had said. She meant it completely. Not as armor, not as a performance of being fine. She meant sit the way you mean simple things when they are simply true. The morning after Conrad left, she had called her mother. Ruth Calloway answered on the second ring the way she always did. Vivian had said, "Mom, He left, and Ruth had said nothing for a moment. A specific silence that Vivian recognized as her mother absorbing something too large for an immediate response, and then said, "I'm getting in the car." She'd driven 4 hours from Vermont. She'd sat on the kitchen floor with Vivian until 2 in the morning. She hadn't said, "I told you so." She hadn't said, "You'll be fine." She'd said, "You are allowed to fall apart for a while. There's no timeline for this." Vivienne had needed to hear that more than she could explain. After Ruth, she had called Preston. That had been the hardest call. Her son's voice, 19 years old, and trying to understand what this meant for the architecture of his entire childhood. She'd said, "Your father and I are separating. This is not your fault. This is not about you. Your father loves you, and I love you, and that does not change." She'd said all the right things. She'd held herself together through the entire call. She'd hung up and sat in the driveway in her car for 30 minutes. "I'm not crazy. I know what I saw. I knew the moment he said my name." She had said that to herself, not out loud, but firmly. The way you have to say things to yourself when the world is working to convince you that what happened didn't happen or didn't mean what you know it meant. "I am not crazy. I know what I saw." The 3 a.m. searches had started that first week. She'd typed things into her phone in the dark of the bedroom. His bedroom now, technically, but she wasn't leaving because she wasn't ready, and also because Celeste Odom had advised her not to. Not yet. How to know if your marriage was real. Signs your husband emotionally checked out years ago. Is it normal to grieve someone who is still alive? What do you do when you realize you've been alone in your marriage for years? She'd read articles. She'd read forum posts from women in similar situations. She'd found, in the fragmented language of strangers on the internet at 3 in the morning, a kind of company she hadn't expected. She wasn't the only one. She had known, intellectually, that she wasn't the only one. But at 3 in the morning, on the bathroom floor, intellectual knowledge is not the same as feeling it. Conrad had moved closer. Not deliberately. The room had shifted. New arrivals, the shuffle of people, finding tables, the natural drift of a crowd. He was perhaps 30 feet away now. Sloane was still engaged in her conversation. Conrad was momentarily alone, holding his drink, looking at something across the room. Then his eyes came back to Vivian. She met them, directly, without smiling, without looking away. She held the eye contact for 3 full seconds. Then she looked away. Not from discomfort, not from avoidance, because something at the main entrance had caught her attention. Elliot Hargrove had arrived. Elliot was 6 feet 1 inch of slightly rumpled competence. He wore his tuxedo with the helpless sincerity of a man who owned, exactly one, and had never quite made peace with the bow tie. It was crooked. It was always crooked. She had offered to fix it approximately 11 times, and he had declined approximately 11 times on the grounds that it gave him character. He scanned the room for her, found her. His face changed in the way it always changed when he found her in a room. Not dramatically, not a movie face, just a small, private shift that said, "There you are." The way you look at something that belongs to you, not because you own it, but because it matters. He crossed the room, he kissed her cheek, he took her hand, his wedding ring caught the chandelier light, and Vivian watched Conrad see it. This was the moment. Not the ring on her finger. Conrad had known she'd remarried. He had received the information through the channels that such information travels, through mutual acquaintances, through Preston, through the particular efficiency of the world of people who all know each other. He had known. But knowing a thing and seeing it are two completely different experiences. Knowing is a fact you can hold at a distance. You can file it away. You can let it sit in the back of a drawer where you don't have to look at it. Seeing is immediate. Seeing has no drawer. Vivian watched Conrad see Elliot Hargrove's ring in the light of the Meridian Foundation chandeliers, and she watched him translate what he was seeing, and she watched the translation arrive. She had heard, through Daphne, through the specific intelligence network that forms around the wreckage of long marriages, that Conrad had assumed certain things about her after he left. He had assumed she'd had a difficult time. He had assumed she was managing but struggling. He had assumed that the life they'd built together would be hard to replicate because it was the product of 22 years and 2 incomes and a particular social position that she couldn't easily reconstruct alone. He had assumed all of this not because he was cruel. He had assumed it because he could not imagine her outside the context of him. He had been wrong, but the story earns this moment only by going back first, by going into the archaeology of what the marriage was, by showing the full cost before showing the recovery. She doesn't go back in anger. She goes back in grief. Their first apartment was a 3rd-floor walk-up in Boston. Summer of the year, she was 23 and he was 28. The radiator clanged all winter, and the windows didn't seal properly, and the upstairs neighbor had a dog that paced at 2 in the morning. They'd eaten dinner on a card table for 6 months while they saved for a real one. He'd carried her over the threshold as a joke, picked her up in the doorway with her bag still over her shoulder, and said, "Welcome home, Mrs. Hartwell." And she'd laughed, and then he hadn't put her down for a long time. That memory was beautiful. That was exactly what made it terrible. Tainted memories are worse than bad ones, Vivian had told Dr. Laura Fenwick. About 8 months into their sessions, bad memories you can set down. You can look at them, acknowledge them, and set them down. Tainted ones follow you, because they used to be good, because you were happy in them. You can't mourn them properly, because part of you is still in love with what they were. Dr. Fenwick had written something down. She had the particular stillness of a woman who had learned to let silence do the work. The chapter of the marriage moved through its stages the way seasons do, so gradually that you don't notice the shift until you're standing in a completely different climate. Preston's birth, Conrad in the delivery room, useless in the way men sometimes are in such moments, and then suddenly not useless at all. He'd cried when Preston arrived, really cried, the ugly, unguarded kind. She had looked at his face in that moment and thought, this is the version of him. This is the one I will love forever. She had loved that version. She wasn't sure when it had left. The first time she suspected something was at a conference in Chicago in 2018. A text on his phone, face down on the restaurant table. He'd picked it up too quickly. She'd noticed the speed of it. She'd said nothing. She'd talked herself out of the noticing the way she'd been talking herself out of noticing for years. He's stressed. The firm is going through expansion. We're both tired. Don't be that woman. Don't be the suspicious wife who makes something out of nothing. She'd had the thought, don't be that woman, and she hadn't understood until much later that she'd used it against herself. That she'd taken her own instincts and filed them under overreaction and locked the drawer. The vacation in Portugal in 2019. She had thought they were reconnecting. She had planned the trip specifically for that purpose. She'd read an article about couples who prioritized travel and had planned the Lisbon itinerary herself. She'd been pleased with herself for taking initiative. She'd thought, we needed this. This is exactly what we needed. Looking back, she understood. He had been saying goodbye. Not consciously, maybe. She didn't know whether to give him that. But the particular quality of his attention that trip, the way he watched her across dinner tables, the way he was present in a way he hadn't been in years. That was the attention of someone who was leaving, the attention of someone who wanted to make sure they'd looked carefully enough at the thing they were losing. She hadn't read it that way. She'd read it as reconnection. She'd been so happy. The small erosions were the hardest to name. Not the big moments, the small ones. The way he stopped asking about her work. She had a 40-person firm. She had commercial projects across the Northeast. She had interesting problems and interesting solutions, and she used to tell him about them over dinner. At some point, she couldn't pinpoint when, she'd noticed that he wasn't listening. Not rudely. He wasn't rude. He was just present in the way of someone whose attention was already given elsewhere. She'd started talking to Daphne instead. She hadn't noticed the shift until it was the entire landscape. After the confrontation, memory came the breathing room. 3 weeks after Conrad left, at 2 a.m, she found herself in the upstairs hallway of the Greenwich house with every single linen closet shelf pulled out. She wasn't sure how she'd started. She was just there, on the hallway floor, with 16 towels and 8 sets of sheets and the spare pillowcases and the good tablecloth they only used at Thanksgiving, and the worn gray towel that Preston had used since he was 7 years old. She picked up the gray towel. She held it for a long time. She didn't cry. She just held it and breathed the particular smell of something washed 100 times, something that had dried the hands of her son for 15 years. Something that had no business mattering this much and mattered enormously. She put it back. She refolded everything, slowly, color ordering the towels, organizing the sheets by size, finding a system and applying it, and focusing on nothing but the system until the light through the hallway window had shifted from black to gray to the specific reluctant silver of early morning. The closet looked perfect when she was done. She stood and looked at it for a moment. Then she went downstairs and made coffee. That had been the night she'd understood something, that there were going to be 2 a.m. moments for a while, that they were not indications of failure. They were just part of it, part of the walking through. Back in the ballroom, Elliot's hand was warm at the small of her back. He had read the room in the way that good, perceptive people read rooms. Quietly, without being told. He'd arrived, kissed her, taken her hand, and then spent approximately 45 seconds assessing the geometry of the evening. He'd identified Conrad across the room. He'd returned his attention to Vivian. He'd said nothing. He didn't need to say anything. Conrad had stopped moving in their direction. She felt Elliot's thumb move once, slowly, across her knuckles. She was here. She was okay. She was more than okay. And she was never going back. She had pretended to be asleep for the last 6 months of her marriage. She hadn't planned it. It hadn't been a strategy. It had started one night when she heard Conrad's car in the driveway and felt something in her chest tighten. A small, quiet contraction of something she didn't want to examine. And she'd turned off her lamp and slid down in the bed and controlled her breathing. Slow, even, gone. She'd heard him come up the stairs, the bathroom routine, the particular sound of him setting his watch on the nightstand, the mattress shifting as he got into bed. He hadn't said her name. She hadn't said anything. And the next night, she'd done it again. And the night after that, and it had become the way evenings ended in the Hartwell house in the last season of their marriage. Both of them awake and neither of them speaking, and the silence between them enormous and unaddressed. She hadn't asked herself why until she was sitting across from Dr. Fenwick 6 months after the divorce. Because, she'd finally said, if I was asleep, I didn't have to feel how alone I was. Pretending to sleep was easier than lying awake next to someone who wasn't there anymore. The divorce had not been simple. She needed people to understand that. It was the kind of thing that got smoothed over in the telling afterward. And then we got divorced, as though it was an administrative procedure, a form you sign and a box you check, and a chapter that closes. It was not like that. Conrad's lawyers, 3 of them from a firm in Manhattan that charged $450 an hour, had built their case around the following argument: that Hartwell and Reed Interior Design, Vivian's firm, had been substantially enabled by Conrad's income during the years of their marriage, that the stability of their shared household had provided the financial foundation from which Vivian had been able to take the professional risks necessary to grow a business, that her success was, in part, a marital asset. She had sat in a conference room on the 38th floor of a building in Midtown and listened to a man she had never met explain to her that her company was partially her husband's. Her company, the one she had started in 2009 with 2 clients and a shared office space in Stamford, Connecticut. The one she had grown to 40 employees and a portfolio that included commercial projects in Boston, New York, and Philadelphia. The one she had built at 2 in the morning on weekends, during school pickups and school plays, and after Conrad's company dinners, when she would come home, still dressed, and sit at the kitchen table with her laptop because she had exactly 90 minutes before she needed to be asleep to function the next day. That company. She had looked across the conference table at the man in the expensive suit and felt something she hadn't expected: clarity. I sat in that room, she told Elliot much later, on one of the early evenings when they were starting to tell each other the real stories. And I felt completely calm, like everything simplified, because I understood in that moment that there was only one possible outcome. I was keeping the company. That was the only fact. Everything else was just time. She'd hired Celeste Odom the next day. Celeste was 62 years old. She had been practicing family law in Connecticut for 31 years. She wore sensible shoes and kept her office in a state of aggressive organization, and had the eyes of someone who had heard every lie that exists, twice, in multiple variations. She'd reviewed the financial documents Vivian provided and said, "This is going to take a while, and it's going to be uncomfortable, and you're going to keep the company." That was the entirety of her assessment. They'd fought for 8 months. Conrad's billionaire resources meant he could sustain the fight indefinitely. Forbes had once estimated his net worth at $1.2 billion. He had the legal infrastructure to pursue this for years if he chose to. What he had not accounted for was Celeste Odom, who had 31 years of experience, or Vivian herself, who had spent 22 years learning how to endure. She kept the company. The settlement gave Conrad certain financial concessions that Vivian had been counseled to accept: the house, the lake property in Vermont that she'd loved. She had looked at the list of what she was releasing and made a calculation. The company was worth more than any of it, not in money, in meaning. It was the only thing she'd built entirely herself, the only piece of the last 22 years that belonged entirely to her. She would have given up every piece of furniture in the house before she gave that up. The chapter of the divorce moved through the ballroom like weather. She was aware of Conrad across the room. She was aware of Sloane laughing at something. She was aware of Elliot, now in conversation with James Whitfield, producing the full-face laugh she had come to understand was one of his defining characteristics. He laughed with his whole face. He didn't manage his expressions in public. She had forgotten that was possible. She had spent so many years in rooms where people managed their expressions, where the performance was the thing, where what you showed was calibrated for effect. That's what I forgot was available, she thought. A man who laughs because something is funny, not because it's useful. Then came the phone call. 2 years ago now. She'd been in the parking lot of a grocery store in New Haven. A number she didn't recognize. She answered because she always answers numbers she doesn't recognize. It's a character flaw. She knows it's a character flaw. The voice on the other end was younger than she'd expected. Careful, prepared. Obviously scripted, in the way that conversations are scripted when someone has rehearsed them for a long time before making them. Sloan Mercer said, "I'm calling because I feel like I owe you an explanation, and probably an apology. I didn't know, at first, about you, about the marriage. I want you to know that. By the time I understood the full picture, I was already in it. I'm sorry for the pain this has caused you." Vivian had sat in a parking lot in New Haven and listened to every word. The grocery bag on the seat beside her. Eggs, she remembered. She'd been buying eggs. She'd said, "Thank you for calling." She'd ended the call. She'd sat in the parking lot for 40 minutes. She hadn't felt what she'd expected to feel. She'd expected anger, or vindication, or some specific satisfaction at having been acknowledged. Instead, she felt finished, like a document that had been waiting for a final signature. She did not want to hate Sloan Mercer. She had hated her for a while, in the way that is available and almost required in the early days. She'd hated her with the specific energy of a woman who needed somewhere to put a pain too large to simply hold. But hate is heavy. It takes up room she needed for other things. I deserved better than this, she'd thought, sitting in the parking lot. Not because I was perfect. Lord knows I wasn't perfect. But because I was present. I showed up every single day. I was there. I was genuinely, completely there. And whatever went wrong between us, and things did go wrong, I know that. I've looked at that honestly. I deserved more than a Tuesday night conversation with a wooden spoon in my hand. The best friend moment had come 3 months into the separation. Lunch with Daphne at a restaurant in Stamford. Halfway through the salads, Daphne had set her fork down and looked at her with the expression of someone who has been holding something for too long. "Viv, I need to tell you something. I've been biting my tongue for years, and I'm done biting it." "Okay," Vivian had said. "I never liked him," Daphne said. "Not once in 22 years. I watched him at 100 dinners and 100 parties, and I thought, he doesn't see her. He has her, but he doesn't see her. And I said nothing, because it wasn't my marriage. But I should have said something. I'm sorry I didn't say it sooner." Vivian had cried into her salad, then laughed, then cried again. Daphne had handed her a napkin and said, "I'm going to need you to pull yourself together, because our waiter is very confused." She'd pulled herself together. She'd kept Daphne close after that. Some things about surviving a marriage's ending, she'd learned, were about what you released, and some were about what you held onto more tightly. The apartment on Whitmore Street was on the 6th floor of a building that had been built in the 1960s and renovated once, incompletely, sometime in the 90s. The ceilings were low. The radiator made a sound in February that she could only describe as philosophical. A sustained, irregular clanging that seemed to be commenting on the nature of endurance. The previous tenant had left a coffee mug on the kitchen counter. White ceramic, chipped along the rim, with a faded print of a lighthouse on the side that had been washed so many times the lighthouse was more suggestion than image. She hadn't thrown it away. For 3 months, she'd used it every morning. She'd picked it up and filled it and carried it to the window that looked out over the street below. And she'd stood there, in the particular morning, quiet of a city, going about its business, and she'd told herself, "You are okay. You are here. This is the day. This is enough." She had not believed it immediately, but she'd said it. Every morning, repetition, Dr. Fenwick had told her, is how we build new neural pathways. The brain responds to what it hears most often. You are quite literally rewiring yourself when you practice a new way of thinking. Vivian had appreciated the neuroscience of it. It gave the process a dignity that pure emotional language sometimes failed to provide. She'd told people she was fine. She was not fine. Not in those first months. She had the company. Hartwell and Reed had continued through the divorce proceedings because she had continued it, showing up to meetings, reviewing designs, managing her staff with the particular professionalism of a woman who understood that her business could not afford her personal crisis, even while her personal crisis was enormous. She had a son she loved. She had Daphne. She had her mother's voice on Sunday evenings, Ruth calling from Vermont, always at 7, always with the opening line, "Just calling to check on my girl." She was 40 years old, sleeping in a bed she'd bought alone, in an apartment where the woman at the front desk called her Ms. Hartwell, and the neighbors nodded in the elevator, and no one knew her in the way of being genuinely known. She was alone in the specific way of being surrounded by people who cared about her and still being alone. "I'm not sad he's gone," she told Dr. Fenwick 6 months into the Whitmore Street apartment. "I need you to understand that, because I think you might expect me to say that I miss him. And I don't. Not exactly. Not him specifically." "What do you miss?" Dr. Fenwick asked. "The version of him I thought I was married to. The version I thought we were building toward. The future I thought we were in." "And when did you lose access to that future?" Vivian had sat with the question. "Year 15, she said finally. "Give or take. I think we lost each other around year 15 and just didn't tell anyone, including ourselves. What made it possible to not tell yourselves?" She didn't answer right away. The office had a plant by the window, a peace lily. She focused on it. "Because we were busy," she said. "Because there was always something next, a project, a trip, a milestone for Preston, a dinner to plan. Because stopping to look at the actual state of the marriage would have required admitting something neither of us was ready to admit. So we kept moving. You can keep a marriage going for years just by keeping it moving." Dr. Fenwick wrote something down. "What do you think would have happened if you'd stopped moving?" "I think we would have seen that we'd been alone in it for a long time," Vivian said. "I think we both would have had to look at that. And I think he found a different solution." She drove to the Connecticut shore in February, not for any specific reason, not as a plan. She'd been in the car going somewhere. She'd now forgotten, and she'd taken the exit for the coast road and then taken another turn and another, following some instinct she wasn't examining, until she was parked at the end of an access road with the ocean gray and enormous and entirely indifferent in front of her. No one else was there. The wind off the water was cold in the way February wind is cold. Not just temperature, but texture. A specific cold that finds the gaps in your coat and settles in your ears and makes the world very immediate and very physical. She watched the water. She didn't call anyone. She didn't put music on. She just watched. The waves came in. They went back. They came in. She thought about her mother, who had raised her to be useful, who had raised her to take care of things and manage situations and be the person who handled the handling. She thought about when useful had become her whole identity. She thought about how long she had been the woman who managed, who handled, who kept the calendar and remembered the details and showed up prepared and made sure everyone else had what they needed. She thought about how thoroughly she had done it, and how invisibly. She didn't cry. She just watched the water come in and go back. After a while, she drove home. She ordered soup from the Thai place on the corner. The place that knew her order by now, the vegetable curry with extra rice, the woman on the phone who said the usual, and Vivian said the usual and felt, surprisingly, a small thread of belonging in that small exchange. She watched a documentary about deep-sea fish. She noted, with genuine mild surprise, that she was slightly okay. Not fine, but okay. A different category. Slightly okay had felt like an achievement that night. Preston's law school graduation happened in May. She'd known Conrad would be there. Of course she'd known. He was Preston's father. He would be at every significant moment of their son's life until one of them died. And she had made her peace with that, because she had to, and also because she'd come to understand that making peace with it was the only thing that served Preston. She'd dressed carefully, navy wrap dress. Not midnight blue, that was later. Navy, classic, appropriate for the day and for her dignity. She'd stood with Daphne on the east side of the auditorium. Preston had walked across the stage, and she'd felt the particular pride of watching your child accomplish something enormous. The kind of pride that fills your chest and sits behind your eyes. The kind that has nothing to do with yourself and everything to do with them. Afterward, in the parking lot, Preston had found her first. He'd hugged her for a long time. She'd breathed him in. The same combination of soap and something specific to him that she'd been breathing in since he was an infant. The particular smell of her child. And she'd held on. Then he'd pulled back and looked at her. "You doing okay, Mom?" "I'm doing really well," she'd said. And it was mostly true. He'd gone to find his father. She'd watched from across the parking lot. She'd watched Preston walk to Conrad, and Conrad open his arms and Preston go into them, and she'd felt it move through her like a current. Not jealousy, not anger, not anything that had a name she'd been taught to use. It was grief, pure and specific. Not grief for Conrad, grief for the parking lot, for the fact that her son had to walk between two people on two sides of an asphalt rectangle. For the family that had once been a single unit and was now geometry. She'd gotten in her car. She'd driven exactly 2 miles. She'd pulled over on a side street and sobbed. Then she'd driven home, washed her face, made tea, called Preston. "I'm so proud of you," she'd said. "I need you to know that. I am so completely proud of you." He'd said, "I know, Mom. I know you are." She'd meant every word. The 3 in the morning searches had started again after that, different than before. The first round had been about surviving. These were about something else. How to forgive yourself for staying too long. Is it possible to start over at 40? What does it feel like when you realize you're finally ready? How do you know when the grief is done? She'd never found an answer to the last one. She'd stopped looking. She'd understood, eventually, that grief doesn't announce its completion. It just becomes quieter. It becomes something you carry differently. It stops being the whole weight and becomes part of the weight. And eventually, part of the weight becomes almost weightless. She wasn't the same woman anymore. She just didn't know yet whether that was a loss or a beginning. It turned out it was neither. It turned out it was just who she was now. The design conference in Philadelphia was in January. She'd almost not gone. She was on a panel. Sustainable materials and commercial interior design, a topic she knew well and had interesting things to say about. And she'd almost called to withdraw 3 days before because she was tired in a way that felt cellular. The kind of tired that a good night's sleep doesn't touch. Daphne had said, "You're going." "I'm exhausted, Daphne." "I know. You're going." She'd gone. The panel had been good. She'd been sharp and direct and occasionally funny, and the room had responded in the way that rooms respond when a speaker stops performing expertise and just demonstrates it. Afterward, she'd found the coffee station in the conference lobby and poured herself something she desperately needed. He was already there. Tall, salt and pepper, wearing the expression of a man who had found something he intended to discuss. He said, "I disagree with your point about reclaimed oak." She looked at him. "Can I tell you why?" he asked. She said, "Please." They stood by the coffee table for 40 minutes. His name was Elliot Hargrove. He was an architect based in Boston. He had opinions about reclaimed materials that were technically well-founded and somewhat wrong in their practical application, and she told him so, and he listened to her correction with the genuine attention of someone who actually wanted to be right rather than to seem right. He was precise. He was funny in a quiet way. He was completely comfortable being challenged by her. He did not try to impress her. He did not manage her. He did not perform. He asked for her card. She gave it to him. He emailed 3 days later. Not a personal email. An article about reclaimed oak with a note that said, "Further evidence for my position. Though I acknowledge you made 3 points I haven't fully answered yet." She'd laughed out loud in her office. She'd forwarded the email to Daphne with no message. Daphne had replied with a single word, "Finally." The courtship had been slow. That was the word she came back to. Slow, not reluctant. She hadn't been reluctant, or not mostly, but unhurried, like two people who had both learned that speed is not a virtue in things that matter. He was 44 years old. He had been married before. He had 2 daughters, Hazel, 20, and Rosie, 17, from that marriage, and he talked about them the way parents talk about children they have genuinely seen, not just raised. He had opinions about architecture and breakfast and the correct way to read a trail map. He had an aging father in Maine whom he visited every month. He had a full life. He never asked her to make herself smaller to fit into it. On their 4th date, dinner in Cambridge, a restaurant they both knew from different contexts, she'd told him about Conrad, all of it. The Tuesday night, the pasta, the wooden spoon, the bathroom floor, the divorce, the legal fight, the apartment on Whitmore Street with the low ceilings and the chipped coffee mug, all of it. He'd listened without interrupting. He didn't say he was an idiot to let you go. She'd heard that one before, and it always landed slightly wrong, like condolence that accidentally made things worse. He didn't say, "You're better off." Another one she'd heard, true, but not what she needed. He said, "That sounds like it cost you a great deal." She looked at him. "It did," she said. "I'm glad you made it through," he said. "I'm glad you survived it." She'd known then, not in the lightning bolt way that stories describe knowing, in the quieter, more durable way, the way you know something is solid because you've pressed on it from multiple directions and it doesn't give. She'd sat in her car, outside his apartment, before the 6th date. Not because she was afraid, or not just because she was afraid. She sat with her hands on the wheel and asked herself the honest question. Are you doing this because you're ready? Or because being alone is harder than you expected, and this is easier than facing that? She sat with the question for 10 full minutes. She watched people walk past on the street outside. A couple walking a dog, a woman on the phone, a teenager on a bicycle going too fast. She got out of the car. She was ready. The proposal had been quiet. No restaurant, no audience. They'd been hiking on a trail in western Massachusetts in October, the leaves doing what New England leaves do in October. He'd stopped at a point where the trail opened and you could see the valley below, and he'd turned to her and he'd said, "I want to keep doing this, all of it." With you. For as long as you'll have me. She'd said, "That's the least romantic proposal I've ever heard." He'd said, "Is that a yes?" She'd said, "It's a yes." He'd had the ring in his jacket pocket, a simple diamond on a simple band. He'd chosen it himself. He'd told her later that he'd walked into the jewelry store and asked for something that looked like her. Clear, direct, and not trying too hard. She'd worn it every day since. Back in the Meridian Foundation ballroom, Elliot was beside her. He was saying something about the ceiling, the architectural bones of the building, the way the original plasterwork had been preserved under the renovation. He gestured upward. She followed his gaze. The plasterwork was extraordinary. She hadn't noticed it before. She looked at the ceiling of the ballroom and then at the man beside her who had pointed it out. And she thought something warm and unguarded and completely private. This is the life, right here, this exact moment. This is it. She hadn't always known that this was available. She'd spent a long time believing that the life she'd had was the life she'd get, that you chose and then you lived inside the choice. And the shape of things was fixed. She knew better now. The shape of things was not fixed. The shape of things was made continuously by what you chose to do with what happened to you. She was choosing this every day. The cocktail hour before the silent auction began at 9:15. Vivian had placed a bid on a long weekend at a Vermont inn, a place she and Elliot had looked at online the previous spring and said someday and never gotten to. She'd spotted it on the auction table early in the evening and written a number in the bidding book and felt the particular small pleasure of attending to something concrete while larger things moved around her. She was standing near the auction tables, champagne in hand, when she became aware of Margaret Hartwell, Conrad's mother, 69 years old, white hair set precisely, pearls, as always, single strand, real, her grandmother's. Posture that suggested slouching was a personal failing she had consciously evolved beyond. Vivian had once been afraid of Margaret Hartwell. For 18 years, she had managed the relationship with the careful precision of someone navigating a landscape of hidden requirements. The right compliments offered at the right moments, the right deference on certain subjects, the right invisibility when invisibility was called for. She had translated Margaret's criticisms into their underlying language. "You are not quite what I had in mind for my son." And she had responded to that underlying language with patience and competence and the determined charm of a woman who had decided that winning over her mother-in-law was simply another project to be managed. She had managed it. She had never quite won. Margaret looked at her now. Vivian recognized the expression with some surprise. It was remorse. Margaret Hartwell, who Vivian had never seen express uncertainty about any position she had ever taken, looked at her with the specific look of a woman who had been thinking about something for a long time and had finally decided to say it. "You look well," Margaret said. "Thank you," Vivian said. A pause. The auction table between them held a weekend ski package and a signed piece of art and the Vermont Inn. Neither of them was looking at any of it. "He told me Shana become obibum, Tomis," Margaret said. Her voice was lower than usual, more careful. "Conrad, after everything was done, he told me that he'd convinced himself you would be all right, that you were resilient." That word. A slight pause. As if resilience is something to be leaned upon rather than earned. Vivian said nothing. She let the silence be its full size. She had learned this in Dr. Fenwick's office. The instinct when silence arrives is to fill it, to smooth it over, to make it easier for everyone. She'd spent 22 years doing exactly that, making silences easier, smoothing the edges of rooms. She had stopped doing that. "I should have called you," Margaret said. She was looking at the auction table now. looking at the Vermont Inn brochure, specifically, as though it were a useful object to focus on. When I understood that things were not good, I knew before you did. I think I knew before Conrad admitted it to himself. I should have called you. I didn't, and I've thought about that. This was not an apology that repaired anything. Vivian understood that clearly. The damage was not the kind that apologies repaired. The years, the invisibility, the particular cruelty of a mother-in-law who'd made her feel insufficient. Those things were documented in her body. They would not be undone by a conversation at a charity auction. But this was something. A woman in her late 60s looking at something she'd done and naming it. That was not nothing. I appreciate that, Vivian said. I genuinely do. They stood together for a moment, two women who had loved the same man differently for different reasons, and had been disappointed in him in ways that had never been given permission to be spoken. Then Margaret nodded once. A precise, concluded nod. She moved away, back toward the other side of the room, back toward the orbit of her son. Vivian stood alone. She picked up her champagne and took a sip. Then Conrad appeared. He walked across the final 15 feet of space between them with the quiet of someone who has been thinking about what to say for 2 hours and has made a decision. His face was... She studied it. Not triumphant, not wounded in the performed way, something navigating between things, something in the process of arriving at a conclusion it hadn't fully reached yet. Vivian, he said. Conrad, she said. You look... He paused. You look really well. I know, she said. The simplicity of it landed in a specific way. He'd expected, she could see, a softer response. Thank you. Or so do you. Or any of the social forms that allow conversations like this to remain at the surface. She'd given him the truth instead. She knew she looked well. She had worked for it. He almost smiled. It started and then thought better of itself. Elliot seems... Another pause. He seems like a good man. He is, she said. Conrad looked at his own hands briefly. He was holding a drink. He wasn't really drinking. She recognized the habit. She'd watched him hold drinks at 100 events without drinking them. I've been thinking, he said, since I saw you. Since I saw... He didn't finish that sentence. I think I didn't understand when I left how much of what we had was you. The texture of it. The quality of it. He was choosing his words carefully. She'd always been able to tell when he was choosing carefully. There was a particular rhythm to it, a slight elongation. I thought the life would just continue. That you would adjust, and I would adjust, and things would... He stopped again. Conrad, she said. Yeah, I did adjust. She said it simply. No edge. No performance of graciousness either. Just the fact, delivered plainly as a fact. He heard it. She watched something move across his face. The full arrival of a cost he had been calculating incorrectly for 3 years. He had run the numbers wrong. He had left a variable out. And now, standing in the Meridian Foundation ballroom, with the chandeliers and the string quartet and his ex-wife in midnight blue, he was recalculating. I'm glad, he said, or she believed him. That was what surprised her. That she believed him. She'd expected to hear it and feel the specific bitterness of an irony too sharp to simply receive. Instead, she heard it and understood it as true. He was glad. He'd wanted her to be okay. He'd never wanted her to suffer. He had simply made a choice and had been wrong about its cost and was now standing in the full truth of that. Good night, Conrad, she said. She turned. She walked back across the ballroom floor toward the table, where Elliot was standing with Daphne. both of them laughing at something that had evidently been very funny. She walked in the midnight blue gown across the full width of the room. She did not look back. She had rehearsed this conversation 100 times. In the shower, on the highway between New Haven and Boston, at 2 in the morning, in the Whitmore Street apartment. She'd run it in her head with different versions of herself. The furious version, the devastated version, the icy version, the triumphant version. In every version, she'd said something precise and brilliant and final. Something that captured everything. Something that made him understand the full size of what he'd done. She hadn't needed any of it. What she'd actually said was small, plain, unarmed. I did adjust. 3 words. And they had done more than any of the brilliant and final things she'd constructed at 2 in the morning, because they were simply true. She had not needed to win. She had needed to be done. She was done. The restroom off the main lobby was all white marble and low lighting. It was quiet in there. After the noise of the ballroom, the quartet, the 200 conversations, the particular acoustic pressure of a large room full of people, the quiet of the marble restroom was almost loud in contrast. Vivian stood at the sink and washed her hands. She looked at herself in the mirror. This was something she'd learned to do without flinching. There had been a period, the Whitmore Street months, when she'd avoided mirrors. Not consciously, not dramatically, just a consistent preference for looking elsewhere. She'd stopped spending time in front of the mirror in the morning. She'd gotten dressed without studying herself. She'd looked at surfaces and windows and screens, but not, if she could arrange it, her own face. Dr. Fenwick had noticed. She'd asked about it once, gently, the way she asked things, setting the observation down where Vivian could look at it or not. "You haven't mentioned how you're feeling about yourself physically," Dr. Fenwick had said. "Your appearance, your sense of yourself in your body." "I don't really think about it," Vivian had said. "That's what I noticed." She looked at herself in the mirror. Now, without flinching, she looked like herself. More than that, she looked like someone she recognized and was not disappointed to recognize. That was the result of work. Deliberate, ongoing work. The kind that doesn't announce itself, but shows up in small increments over 2 years, and then one day you're standing in a marble restroom looking at yourself, and something is simply there that wasn't there before. The door opened. Sloane Mercer came in. They saw each other immediately. The room was small. There was nowhere for the recognition to be avoided or delayed. Red dress, full makeup, hair still perfect. But Vivian had learned, in the last 2 years, to read a different layer of things. And what she read in Sloane's face, under the makeup and the composure, was tired. Not visibly tired, privately tired. The kind that lives in the muscles around the eyes. Sloane moved to the sink beside her, opened her clutch, the normal motions of a woman in a restroom. The silence stretched. "I called you once," Sloane said. Her voice was even. "A few years ago." "I remember," Vivian said. Sloane looked at her own reflection. Not at Vivian, at herself. "I thought it would help. Calling you, I thought it would make me feel better about what had happened, what I'd done. Did it? No? Me neither," Vivian said. "But I think I needed to hear it anyway." A small sound from the hallway, the muffled noise of the auction getting underway, the auctioneer's voice beginning. Sloane glanced at the door, then back at the mirror. "He talks about you sometimes," she said. "Not often, but occasionally. He says," a pause, "he says you deserved better." Vivienne dried her hands on one of the white folded towels. She thought about that. The information. What to do with it. "He's right," she said. A beat. "So did you," she said. Sloane turned from the mirror. She looked at Vivian directly for the first time since entering the room. Something shifted in her face. She hadn't expected that. Vivian could see it clearly. She'd expected something else from this moment. Something more in keeping with the script. The wronged wife, the other woman, the expected hostility, or the brittle civility, or the terrible silence of two women who simply could not acknowledge each other. She'd gotten something outside the script. Vivienne hadn't planned it. She'd said it because it was true, and because she was tired of carrying the weight of a story in which Sloane Mercer was simply a villain. Villains were convenient, but they were also heavy. She'd set down a lot of heavy things in the last 2 years. She wasn't picking them up again. "Take care of yourself," Vivian said. She meant it, not warmly, not coldly, as a practical human wish, delivered without theater, offered at no cost to herself. She left. In the hallway, she paused. She leaned her back against the wall, just for a moment. Not from weakness, from the desire to mark it. This quiet moment in a marble hallway that no one would photograph or post or applaud. The small, private moment of having been in a room with the person who had been cast as her story's central villain, and having extended to her the most basic category of human care. She didn't feel noble about it. She felt clean, like something that had been waiting to be resolved had resolved itself. Not loudly, not dramatically, just done. Somewhere along the way, she thought, I became someone I actually like. She stood in the hallway and breathed and let herself feel that. It wasn't arrogance. It wasn't pride in the aggressive sense. It was just recognition. The woman who'd eaten rigatoni alone in a kitchen in Greenwich, Connecticut, on a Tuesday night in October. That woman had been good. She had been genuinely good. She'd had things worth honoring. She hadn't been foolish for the love she'd given, or the years she'd spent, or the trust she'd extended. But this woman, standing in a hallway at a charity gala, at 41 years old, this woman, Vivian thought, I would choose. She pushed off the wall. She went back to the ballroom. She went back to Elliot. Starting over had felt impossible once. She'd thought that for a long time. Staying had felt worse. She'd understood that clearly, even when she hadn't had words for it. But the starting over had looked, from where she'd stood, in the Greenwich kitchen, like a landscape she couldn't even locate from where she was. She'd located it. She'd crossed it. Starting over felt impossible, but staying felt worse, and leaving gave me back something I hadn't known I'd misplaced. Myself. She walked across the ballroom floor and found her husband. The auction was in its final stages. The auctioneer, a tall man with the practiced energy of someone who'd done this 100 times, was working through the last items on the list. A weekend retreat, a piece of original art, a wine collection. The Vermont Inn had been settled earlier. Vivian had won it. She'd shown Elliot the confirmation on the bidding sheet with the particular small satisfaction of someone who has wanted a thing for a while and has managed to acquire it through the slightly absurd mechanism of a charity auction. He'd looked at the brochure. February in Vermont. Snow on the hills in the photograph, a fireplace, a dining room with the kind of light that exists only in places where someone has thought carefully about it. February, he said. February, she confirmed. We should go in February. That's when it's booked, Elliot. I'm saying I want to go. I'm enthusiastic about it. You and snow, she said. I contain multitudes, he said. She laughed. The real kind. The full-face kind that she'd learned from watching him do it. The kind that doesn't calculate itself. Daphne appeared, refreshed champagne in hand, wearing the expression of someone who had had a thoroughly satisfying evening and intended to extract every last remaining satisfaction from it. Well, she said, quite an evening. You could say that, Vivian said, Conrad looked like a man doing long division in his head all night. Vivian smiled. I think he was. How do you feel? The question landed simply. Daphne asked it the way she asked things when she actually wanted to know, without preamble, without a social form around it. Just the question. Vivian considered it honestly. She looked around the ballroom. The chandeliers, the remaining guests, the auctioneer finishing up, the white tablecloths, with the wreckage of a good evening on them. Glasses half full, centerpieces slightly disturbed, the natural entropy of a room where people have been present and alive for several hours. She thought about the woman she'd been the last time she'd been in a room like this. The woman at Conrad's events, replenishing his drink and remembering everyone's names. The woman who had been good at every visible thing and had slowly become invisible. She thought about the apartment on Whitmore Street, the chipped coffee mug with the lighthouse, the radiator that clanged, the linen closet she'd reorganized at 2 in the morning. She thought about the Connecticut shore in February, the cold, the waves coming in. She thought about a conference in Philadelphia, a man at a coffee station, an article about reclaimed oak that had arrived 3 days later. She thought about a trail in western Massachusetts in October, yellow leaves, a valley below. I want to keep doing this, all of it, with you. She thought about the ring on her finger, not as a trophy, not as an answer to Conrad, not as a score in any competition. The ring was evidence, evidence of 2 years of choosing, again and again, to rebuild, evidence of learning, finally, what it felt like to be genuinely seen, evidence that a life could be lost, and then, not replaced, nothing is replaced, but expanded into something new, something that had room in it that the old life hadn't had. Grateful, she said. I feel grateful. Daphne looked at her for a moment. Good, she said, simply, like a verdict she'd been waiting to render. Elliot returned from a brief exchange with the architect he'd been speaking with earlier, the one who'd kept him in an animated discussion about load-bearing walls for 20 minutes. He looked at her, the small private shift. There you are. Ready to get out of here? He asked. In a few minutes, she said. She wanted a few more minutes. She had spent a decade thinking the problem was Conrad, then 6 months certain the problem was herself, then a long, slow reconstruction of understanding. There was no problem. There was just a woman who had stopped tending to herself while tending to everything else. And a marriage that needed 2 present, invested people to survive and had only ever had 1. And a man who had found it easier to find something new than to face what was broken between them. And all of that, all of it, had led to a Whitmore Street apartment and a chipped coffee mug and a therapist with a peace lily and a trail in Massachusetts and a man who disagreed about reclaimed oak and was currently standing beside her in a slightly crooked bow tie. She didn't blame Conrad anymore. She had, at various intensities, for a long time. She didn't. She didn't blame herself anymore either. That one had taken longer. She was just free. Free was a word she'd been cautious with. It felt too large, sometimes, too certain, too clean for something that was actually complicated and ongoing, and occasionally still difficult. But standing in the Meridian Foundation ballroom at 41 years old, having walked through the full length of this evening, Conrad's arrival, Sloane on his arm, the ring in the light, Margaret's remorse, the confrontation, the restroom, standing here and feeling, not triumphant, but genuinely, quietly, solidly at peace. Free was the right word. She put her champagne glass down. Okay, she said to Elliot, let's go. They said goodbye to Daphne near the coat check. A proper goodbye, the kind that holds everything that doesn't need to be said. Daphne hugged her for a long time, long enough to mean something, long enough to be the hug of a 20-year friendship that had been there through the worst of it and was here now for this. "Call me tomorrow," Daphne said. "You were present for most of the evening. I want your version. You'll get every detail." Daphne released her, looked at her once, the specific assessing look. "You did good tonight," she said. "I just showed up," Vivian said. "That was the whole thing," Daphne said. Elliot got their coats from the coat check attendant, a young man who'd been cheerful all evening and was now visibly ready to go home, which Vivian appreciated as an entirely reasonable position. Elliot helped her into her coat, the way he always did, without being asked, without making a performance of it, just there, holding the coat, warm in the lobby air, his hands briefly at her shoulders as she settled it on. She turned to say something to him, and that was when she saw them, Conrad and Sloane, across the lobby. They were leaving too. Sloane was already wrapped in her coat, moving toward the main doors with the purposeful energy of a woman who has had a long enough evening. Conrad was a few steps behind her. She studied him, one last time, with the detachment she'd earned. He looked smaller, not diminished, not crumbled, just properly sized. The room had stopped bending around him. He was a tall man in a navy tuxedo at the end of a long evening, and that was exactly what he was. And it was enough. He looked up. Across the lobby, he saw Vivian and Elliot at the coat check. He saw Elliot help her into her coat. He saw Vivian turn and say something that made Elliot's whole face change. Conrad nodded once. Small, conclusive. Vivian nodded back. That was all. It was enough. It was exactly enough. The car was warm. Elliot had a gift for remembering to start the heat before long events. So the car was waiting rather than cold when they arrived. One of the small, practical kindnesses that she had learned to recognize as a language. He had music on low, something instrumental, something warm and undemanding. The kind of music that exists to fill a space rather than ask for attention. The Connecticut roads at night. The particular dark of late November in New England. Deep and specific, and full of bare trees that were just dark shapes against a slightly less dark sky. She leaned her head back against the seat. "You okay?" Elliot asked. "Yeah," she said, "really." He took her hand, drove. She thought about the woman in the kitchen, wooden spoon, rigatoni, hearing her own name in a voice that had become formal. She didn't feel pity for that woman. She felt something more respectful than that. She felt what you feel for someone who carried something heavy and kept going and didn't know yet that there was a different kind of life on the other side of the weight. She didn't know, Vivian thought. She couldn't see it from there, but she kept going anyway. That deserves something more than pity. That deserves respect. She thought about Preston. He would call Sunday morning. He always called Sunday mornings. The specific rhythm of it, established in the first months after the divorce, when they'd both needed to know the other was okay. He'd call and say, "Hey, Mom," in the particular voice he used for her specifically. And she'd ask about his week, and he'd ask about hers, and they'd talk for 20 minutes about nothing important and everything real. She would tell him she'd run into his father. He would ask how she was. She would say, "I'm good. I'm genuinely good." He would say, "Yeah." She would say, "Yeah." And it would be true. She thought about the Vermont Inn. February. Snow on the hills. A fireplace. Elliot in a rented winter coat because he owned no adequate cold weather gear despite his enthusiasm for snow. And she would make a list of what he needed to buy, and he would buy approximately none of it and arrive in February with the same inadequate jacket, and she would give him grief about it all weekend. She thought about the Whitmore Street apartment, the chipped coffee mug, the lighthouse, almost invisible from washing. She'd packed it when she moved out. She hadn't thrown it away. It was in the cabinet of the house she shared with Elliot, now, in among their mugs. No particular significance to anyone who looked at it. Just a white mug with a lighthouse. She kept it because she'd made herself a promise in that apartment. You will be okay. You are here. This is the day. The mug was evidence that she'd kept that promise. She thought about Elliot's hand, warm and specific, and here. The city lights moved past the windows, not dramatically, just steadily. Small lights, then more, then the particular constellation of a neighborhood, then another, like traveling through something lit and living. She closed her eyes. She thought about the ring. She didn't look at it, didn't hold it up to the passing lights, just thought about it. The simple band, the diamond that looked like her, according to the woman at the jewelry store who had relayed Elliot's instructions, clear and direct and not trying too hard. She thought about what it had meant to Conrad tonight. She thought about what it meant to her. The difference was the whole story. To Conrad, the ring had been a revelation, an information point he hadn't calculated, evidence of a future he hadn't predicted when he'd made his choice. To Vivian, the ring was something entirely different. It was not an answer to Conrad. It was not a rebuttal, not a comeback, not a visible symbol of winning a competition she'd never signed up for. It was 2 years of choosing, every morning in the Whitmore Street apartment, choosing to get up, every session with Dr. Fenwick, choosing to look honestly at hard things, every trail hike in Massachusetts, every conversation about reclaimed oak, every evening when Elliot showed up and was simply, consistently, genuinely present, every day of choosing this. That's what the ring was. She had stopped needing it to mean something to Conrad a long time ago. It only needed to mean something to her. The music played softly. Elliot drove. She kept her eyes closed and felt the particular peace of being in the right place. Not the place you ended up, not the place you settled for, but the place you walked toward, deliberately, through everything that stood between you and it. It. She had walked through a great deal. She was here. You are okay. You are here. This is the day. Not a consolation anymore. A fact. The car turned onto their street. She recognized it by the particular rhythm of it. The slight rise before the corner, the way the tree branches, on the left side, made their own specific shadow in the headlights. Home. We're here, Elliot said quietly. I know, she said. She didn't open her eyes right away. She sat for one more moment in the warmth of the car, with the music, with his hand still in hers. Then she opened her eyes. She looked at her husband. He was watching her with the expression she had come to understand was specifically hers. Patient and warm and completely without agenda. Ready? He asked. Yes, she said. They got out of the car together. The November air was cold, sharp, the kind of cold that makes you present. The stars above the neighborhood were doing what stars do, indifferent and ancient and quietly overwhelming if you looked directly at them. She looked, for just a moment. Then Elliot opened the front door, and the warmth of the house came out to meet her, and she stepped inside. The ring on her finger caught the light from the entryway lamp. She didn't even notice. She'd stopped needing it to catch anyone's eye a long time ago. It only had to be what it was. Evidence. That a woman could be left in a kitchen on a Tuesday night with a wooden spoon in her hand and sit on a bathroom floor for 4 hours and eat rigatoni alone and fight for 8 months to keep what she'd built and move into a 6th-floor apartment with low ceilings and a chipped coffee mug, and drive to the shore in February and watch the water come in and go back and type things into her phone at 3 in the morning and sit across from a therapist and say the true things and stand in a parked car outside someone's apartment and ask herself the honest question and get out of the car and choose. That was what the ring meant, not him, not the man who'd walked into a gala with someone else on his arm, not the applause of a room, not the look on a face across a ballroom. Her, just this, just home.
Before you go, I want to sit with you here for just a moment, because this story, Vivian's story, it isn't really about a gala, it isn't about a ring, it isn't even about a man who finally understood what he lost. It's about something much quieter than any of that. It's about the Tuesday nights, the ones nobody sees, the ones where you sit on a bathroom floor and the silence of the house wraps around you like something physical. The ones where you reorganize a closet at 2 in the morning, not because the closet needs organizing, but because your hands need something to do while your heart figures out how to keep beating. It's about the 3 in the morning searches, the ones you type into your phone in the dark because you need to know, is this normal? Am I going to be okay? Is it possible to start over? What does it feel like when the grief is finally done? Here is what Vivian's story teaches us, and I want you to hear this slowly, because it matters. You can lose a marriage and not lose yourself. You can lose a home, a future you thought was certain, a version of your life you'd been building for decades, and still, underneath all of that, still be there, still be you, intact, waiting, stronger in the places where the fractures healed. The world will tell you that surviving a betrayal is about revenge, about winning, about the moment the person who hurt you finally sees what they lost and falls apart in a satisfying way. But that's not what healing looks like. Healing looks like standing in a room and not needing to perform anything. Not fury, not forgiveness, not triumph, just presence. I did adjust. 3 words. That's all Vivian said to the man who'd spent 22 years at the center of her life. 3 words. Calm, plain, true. And they contained everything. They contained every morning she'd gotten out of bed when she didn't want to. Every session with her therapist where she said the uncomfortable, true thing. Every night she'd driven to the shore and watched the water come in and go back and given herself permission to not be fine yet. They contained the choice she made over and over to tend to herself, to become someone she could recognize and respect and, eventually, genuinely like. 3 words that took 2 years to earn. Here is the second lesson. The people who leave us. They often leave with a story about who we are. Conrad believed Vivian would struggle. He believed the life they'd built together was somehow his to take with him. He couldn't imagine her outside the context of him. This is what people do when they underestimate us. They make a prediction about our smallness, and they are wrong. Because resilience is not something that announces itself in the good years. It doesn't show up at the dinner parties or the charity galas or the moments when everything is functioning correctly. Resilience shows up at 2 in the morning in a hallway with a worn gray towel in your hands. It shows up in the parking lot outside your son's graduation, 2 miles from the venue, when you pull over and sob and then drive home and wash your face and call him to say, "I am so proud of you." It shows up in the small, private, unwitnessed moments of continuing. Conrad saw the ring on Vivian's finger and finally understood the cost of his calculation. But Vivian didn't need him to understand. She had stopped needing that a long time before. And that is the third lesson. Healing is complete not when the other person finally sees what they lost. Healing is complete when you stop needing them to. When you stand in a room and feel, not triumph, not bitterness, not the particular ache of old wounds reopening, but peace. The ring on Vivian's finger wasn't a message to Conrad. It wasn't a symbol of winning. It was evidence. Evidence that a woman can be left in a kitchen with a wooden spoon in her hand and a marriage ending in real time, and survive it, and rebuild it, and build something better, something that has room in it for who she actually is. If you are in the middle of your Tuesday night right now, if you are on the bathroom floor or in the closet at 2 in the morning or in the parking lot 2 miles from where you need to be, I want you to hear this. You are not at the end of your story. You are in the hardest chapter, and the hardest chapter is not the last one. Keep going. Tend to yourself the way you have always tended to everyone else. And one day, not today, maybe not for a while, you will stand in a room, in whatever your midnight blue gown is, and you will feel something you may have forgotten was possible. You will feel like yourself, and it will be enough. It will be more than enough. It will be everything. If this resonates with you, if you've ever had to rebuild yourself from the inside out, hit that like button right now. Leave a comment below and tell me, what was the moment you decided to stop settling? Subscribe to this channel because every week we bring you stories about real women, real strength, and real second chances. And share this with someone who needs to hear it today. Your story isn't over, it's just getting good. Final editorial note. The content in this story was manually researched, developed, and edited by our team to bring you meaning, emotional truth, and life lessons grounded in real human experience. Every detail was crafted with intention to make sure that when you finish listening, you carry something with you, not just a story, something true. Thank you for being here. Thank you for listening all the way to the end. That says something about you. See you in the next story.